Thank you.
You're welcome. Let us know if you need anything else.
Open the gate, now.
Right away.
Officers, stand by. Officers, what is going on?
Ma'am, please stay back.
That's my neighbor. Is he okay?
Just tell us what's happening.
When I bought my townhouse in the quiet, tree-lined community of Ridgeway Commons, I expected manicured lawns, passive-aggressive newsletters, and the occasional argument about trash placement. What I didn't expect was to become the target of the most aggressive HOA president I had ever encountered. A woman who treated her title like a crown and the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. Ridgeway Commons marketed itself as luxury living with resort-style amenities. The crown jewel was the private community pool, heated, gated, surrounded by palm trees that had no business surviving in our climate. Access required a physical key card and a small brass backup key, both issued by the HOA. Residents guarded those keys like treasure because replacing them came with a hefty fine. I received mine the week I moved in. I signed the paperwork, paid the transfer fees, and introduced myself politely at the management office. That's when I first met her, the HOA president. She carried herself with the sharp posture of someone who believed rules were sacred and flexibility was weakness. Her smile was tight, calculated, and entirely performative. From the beginning, she made it clear she ran things. Over the next few weeks, I noticed her pattern. She patrolled the neighborhood daily, clipboard in hand. She photographed slightly overgrown hedges. She left violation notices for wreaths deemed seasonally inappropriate. She once measured the height of someone's lawn ornaments. Residents whispered about her but rarely confronted her. Most just paid the fines and moved on. I, on the other hand, tend to read documents before signing them and bylaws before obeying them. The trouble started on a Saturday afternoon. It was 90 degrees, and the pool was packed with families. I arrived alone, planning to swim laps. I unlocked the gate with my key card and noticed a new sign zip tied to the fence. POACES rescrisida. Kawais scubis confiscate for compianc. That was news to everyone. Residents were confused. There had been no email, no vote, no meeting. The posted hours were the same, the rules were the same. The only difference was that the HOA president was standing near the entrance like a nightclub bouncer, scanning wrists for key bands and staring people down. She stopped me before I reached the water. She demanded to inspect my key. There was no policy requiring random inspections. I knew that because I had read the entire 74-page governing document the week I moved in. I calmly asked her to cite the section that allowed her to confiscate privately issued access devices without board vote or written notice. That's when the temperature shifted. Her face tightened, her tone sharpened. She accused me of being combative and non-compliant. She claimed new emergency powers had been enacted due to security concerns. When I asked for written documentation, she waved her clipboard like it was a badge of authority. I refused to hand over my key. That refusal was apparently a declaration of war. By Monday morning, I received a certified letter accusing me of violating pool safety protocols. It stated that my access privileges were under review and that failure to surrender my keys voluntarily could result in fines of up to $500 per day. $500 per day for using an amenity included in my monthly dues. The letter was unsigned but unmistakably hers. Most people would have backed down. Most people would have handed over the keys to avoid escalation. But the more I reviewed the bylaws, the clearer it became she had no unilateral authority to confiscate anything. Not without a board vote. Not without documented cause. So I ignored the letter. 3 days later, the situation escalated beyond passive-aggressive paperwork. On Thursday evening, as I pulled into my driveway, a marked police cruiser was parked directly in front of my townhouse. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Porch lights flicked on. The HOA president stood on the sidewalk with her arms folded, looking victorious. Beside her was her husband, uniformed, armed, and wearing the expression of a man who believed he was about to resolve a minor civil issue quickly. She had sent her cop husband to take my pool keys. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that I wasn't just another resident willing to be intimidated. And as I stepped out of my car and assessed the scene, I realized this neighborhood dispute was about to become something much bigger than pool access. Because I wasn't just a homeowner, I was undercover federal law enforcement, and she had just crossed a line she didn't understand. The confrontation hadn't even begun, and already Ridgeway Commons was holding its breath. By the time I stepped out of my car, half the block had transformed into a silent audience. Front doors were cracked open just enough to watch without being seen. Curtains twitched. Porch lights cast long shadows across the pavement. Ridgeway Commons thrived on drama the way some communities thrived on block parties. And tonight, the HOA president had delivered prime-time entertainment. She stood beside the cruiser like she had orchestrated a victory parade. Her posture radiated triumph. This was escalation as spectacle. Her husband, still in full uniform, remained near the driver's side door. The badge, the duty belt, the cruiser. All of it was meant to send one message: comply. I could almost see the narrative she had already built in her mind. Difficult homeowner refuses HOA directive. Officer responds. Keys confiscated. Order restored. Authority affirmed. What she didn't factor into her script was someone who understood procedure better than she did. The officer began with the standard posture of calm authority. Neutral stance, hands resting lightly near his belt. He presented the situation as a community dispute and explained that he was there to retrieve HOA property. That phrasing alone told me everything: HOA property. The keys weren't leased equipment. They weren't temporary passes. They were issued access devices included with ownership and governed by bylaws that did not grant unilateral seizure rights to the HOA president. If this had been an official board action with documentation, it would be a civil matter handled through certified notice, not a marked cruiser at dusk. But this wasn't about policy. This was about power. The HOA president began listing accusations. Non-compliance, refusal to follow emergency directives, creating a hostile environment at the pool. Each claim was exaggerated, framed to sound urgent. She painted me as disruptive simply for asking for written authority. The officer listened, nodding slightly. But I noticed something important: he hadn't asked to see the bylaws. He hadn't requested documentation. He was relying entirely on her version. That was mistake number one. He requested the keys. I declined calmly. Not because I wanted a confrontation, but because I understood the implications. If I surrendered them under police presence, it would establish a precedent that HOA leadership could weaponize law enforcement for personal enforcement of disputed civil rules. That's a dangerous line. The temperature on the sidewalk shifted. The neighbors leaned closer in their door frames. The HOA president's composure thinned as I remained steady. She clearly expected hesitation, fear, embarrassment. Instead, she got procedural resistance. I asked whether there was a court order. There wasn't. I asked whether a crime had been alleged. None had. I asked whether he was acting in an official capacity to enforce criminal statute or assisting in a civil property dispute at the request of a private citizen. That distinction matters. The officer's posture subtly changed. His certainty softened. He realized the optics weren't as simple as his wife had presented them. The HOA president attempted to regain control, escalating her claims. She suggested that failure to comply could result in trespassing charges related to pool use. That was legally flimsy at best. Owners cannot trespass on commonly owned property without due process revocation. Still, she pressed forward. This wasn't about safety. It wasn't about policy. It was about dominance. And that's when I made a decision. Up until that moment, I had kept my professional life separate from my home life. Undercover assignments require discretion, privacy, minimal exposure. But as I watched a marked police cruiser being used as leverage in a personal HOA dispute, I recognized something bigger unfolding. This was misuse of position. Carefully, deliberately, I reached into my wallet, not for the pool key. For identification she never expected to see. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The neighbors sensed it before they understood it. The officer saw it as soon as I opened the credential case. The HOA president's confidence flickered, replaced by something unfamiliar: uncertainty. The power dynamic had just flipped, and the quiet suburban street of Ridgeway Commons was about to learn that some lines, once crossed, can't be uncrossed. The moment I opened my credential case, the air changed. It wasn't dramatic. There were no flashing lights or raised voices. But the subtle shift was undeniable. Authority recognizes authority. The officer saw it immediately. The seal, the formatting, the unmistakable federal identification that doesn't get handed out casually. His posture straightened, not in aggression, but in recalibration. The HOA president, however, didn't process it right away. From where she stood, all she saw was a wallet extended between two men and a conversation she was no longer controlling. Her expression flickered from irritation to confusion, then tightened into something defensive. I identified myself clearly and professionally, not as a threat but as context. I explained that I was currently assigned to federal investigative work, and that while I did not discuss the specifics of my role publicly, I was very familiar with procedural boundaries between civil disputes and criminal enforcement. I emphasized that this situation, A homeowners association disagreement over amenity access did not meet the threshold for police intervention absent criminal behavior. The officer's eyes shifted briefly toward his wife. That glance spoke volumes. He understood in that instant the liability implications. A marked cruiser parked at a private residence to retrieve pool keys, acting at the request of a spouse who also happened to be the complainant. No court order, no documented crime, no board vote. It wasn't criminal, but it was problematic. The HOA president attempted to regain control by reframing the issue. She insisted this was about community safety. She implied there were ongoing investigations into rule violations at the pool. She spoke with increasing urgency as if volume could substitute for legitimacy. But urgency without documentation is noise. I calmly requested clarification. Had there been a formal board vote authorizing confiscation of issued access keys? Had certified notice been sent detailing a specific bylaw violation? Was there any record of due process? Silence answered those questions. The officer's stance shifted again, this time subtly distancing himself from the center of the conflict. He clarified that he had been told HOA property was being unlawfully withheld. That language suggested intentional misrepresentation. Whether by omission or exaggeration, the situation had not been presented to him accurately. That realization landed heavily. Around us, the neighborhood audience had grown. A few residents had stepped onto sidewalks. The spectacle was no longer just about a pool key, it was about watching authority unravel in real time. The HOA president's composure cracked. Her confidence depended on momentum, and momentum had stalled. Instead of a swift surrender, she now faced a procedural stalemate, one that was exposing overreach. She pivoted tactics. Rather than arguing legality, she attacked tone. She accused me of intimidation. She claimed that presenting federal credentials was an attempt to bully her. It was a strategic deflection, shifting from policy to perception. But facts are stubborn things. I reiterated that I had no intention of escalating the situation beyond what it already was. I simply would not surrender property rights without due process. I also made it clear that misuse of law enforcement resources in civil disputes can attract scrutiny. Not from me personally, but from oversight structures designed to prevent precisely this kind of entanglement. That landed. The officer exhaled slowly. The cruiser's presence, once symbolic of control, now looked like an overextension. After a brief, quiet exchange between them, he returned to a neutral tone. Without declaring fault, he stated that this was a civil HOA matter and advised resolution through proper board procedures. In other words, he disengaged. The cruiser lights remained off. The engine started. And within seconds, the spectacle that had been designed to intimidate me rolled quietly down the street. But the damage was done. The neighbors had seen it. The power play, the reversal, the retreat, and the HOA president stood alone on the sidewalk, no longer flanked by a symbol of enforcement, just a clipboard and a bruised ego. What she didn't realize yet was that this confrontation wasn't over, because humiliation, when mixed with unchecked authority, rarely leads to reflection. It leads to retaliation, and I could already see it forming behind her eyes. Humiliation is a dangerous fuel source. It doesn't cool off overnight. It simmers. It rewrites events in the mind of the embarrassed until they become the victim instead of the aggressor. And by the following week, it was clear the HOA president had chosen escalation over reflection. The retaliation began quietly. First came the violation notices. One appeared taped to my garage, improper trash bin placement, the $75 fine. The bin had been positioned exactly where it had sat every week since I moved in. Then came another, unauthorized exterior modification. The modification in question was a welcome mat. Within 3 days, I had accumulated 4 separate citations, each vague, each citing sections of the bylaws that, when cross-referenced, didn't actually apply to my property. This wasn't oversight, it was strategy. The pattern was obvious to anyone paying attention. Several neighbors stopped me during evening walks, lowering their voices as they asked what had happened the night of the cruiser. Word had spread fast. Stories in HOA communities travel quicker than official emails, and with every whisper, the president's authority weakened. That's when the certified letter arrived. It announced an emergency board meeting to address resident conduct detrimental to community harmony. The language was pointed but nonspecific. It didn't name me directly, but it didn't have to. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the clubhouse. I attended. The room was fuller than usual. Residents who had ignored prior meetings suddenly found their calendars open. The HOA president sat at the head of the folding table, flanked by 2 visibly uncomfortable board members. Her husband was not present this time. She began with procedural formalities, then shifted quickly to the topic of compliance enforcement. Her tone was measured, but underneath it was something sharper. Controlled anger. She proposed a motion granting the HOA president temporary authority to suspend amenity access without full board vote in cases of suspected rule violations. Suspected. Not confirmed. Not documented. Suspected. It was a power grab disguised as efficiency. As she spoke, I watched the room. Heads tilted. Brows furrowed. Residents flipped through printed copies of the bylaws. Several exchanged glances that signaled growing skepticism. When the floor opened for comments, the shift became undeniable. One homeowner calmly asked where in the governing documents such unilateral power existed. Another questioned whether recent events had influenced the proposal. A third pointed out that the board, not the president alone, was granted enforcement authority. The president attempted to steer the conversation back to community safety, but the narrative was slipping. People had seen the cruiser. They had seen the overreach. And now they were seeing the attempted codification of that overreach into permanent authority. I remained silent. There is power in letting a room reach its own conclusions. The motion went to a vote. It failed. Not narrowly, not ambiguously, decisively. For the first time since I moved into Ridgeway Commons, the HOA president looked uncertain in her own seat. But rejection didn't end the conflict, it transformed it. Within days, rumors surfaced that she was consulting the OA's legal counsel. There were whispers of a special assessment being discussed, something about security upgrades for the pool area, key reissuance fees, surveillance installation, budget reallocations, collective punishment disguised as improvement. The board members began distancing themselves. Emails grew shorter, response times slowed. It was as if they suddenly recognized the liability orbiting their leadership. And then something unexpected happened. A neighbor forwarded me a scanned copy of internal HOA correspondence. A message from the president to the board written the night of the cruiser incident. It contained language that shifted everything. She referenced using available leverage to ensure compliance. She mentioned making an example out of residents who challenged authority. And most concerning of all, she described coordinating enforcement presence to reinforce policy seriousness. That phrase lingered. Coordinating enforcement presence. The line between personal influence and official misuse was thinning. And for someone in her position, married to law enforcement, presiding over financial decisions, exercising selective enforcement, that line mattered. Because this was no longer just about pool keys. It was about whether power in Ridgeway Commons operated within rules or above them. And as more residents began digging into budgets, meeting minutes, and enforcement records, a deeper question started to surface. What else had been happening under the surface of this OA? Once people start looking, they rarely stop. The failed vote had done more than block a power grab. It had awakened curiosity. Ridgeway Commons had operated for years on routine complacency. Dues were paid, rules were followed, meetings were sparsely attended. The HOA president had thrived in that vacuum, but now residents were reading. Budgets that once went unquestioned were being examined line by line. Meeting minutes were compared against financial statements. Enforcement records were cross-referenced with violation histories. And what began as mild skepticism evolved into structured scrutiny. The first irregularity surfaced in the pool maintenance budget. According to the annual report, the community had approved a significant increase in pool security expenses the previous year. The justification cited vandalism, concerns, and after-hours misuse. Yet no formal incident reports had been shared with residents. No insurance claims, no police logs, just an increase. Then someone noticed the vendor name attached to the security contract. It wasn't a large company, it wasn't even regional. It was a small LC registered 2 towns over. Public records revealed the registered agent shared a last name with the HOA president. That discovery traveled through Ridgeway Commons faster than any violation notice ever had. The contract itself wasn't illegal on its face. But the absence of competitive bids, the lack of board-wide approval documentation, and the family connection created optics that were difficult to defend. Conflict of interest policies existed in the bylaws. They were rarely invoked. Until now. Meanwhile, enforcement records told another story. Several residents quietly compared violation histories. A pattern emerged. Those who questioned fines or attended meetings frequently received follow-up citations within weeks. Those who remained silent rarely appeared on enforcement logs. Selective enforcement is subtle. It hides behind technicalities, but when patterns repeat, subtlety fades. The board members began requesting internal audits. Emails leaked again, this time unintentionally. A misdirected reply all revealed the HOA president instructing the property manager to prioritize compliance visibility. For specific addresses, mine was listed first. That single email shifted the atmosphere from gossip to gravity. Retaliation through selective enforcement, misuse of police presence, possible undisclosed vendor relationships. None of it alone guaranteed consequences. But together they formed a mosaic of governance abuse. Residents organized. A special meeting was petitioned under the bylaws recall provision. It required signatures from 30% of homeowners. Within 4 days, they had 42%. The clubhouse filled beyond capacity on the night of the recall vote. The HOA president entered with her usual posture, but the room felt different. It wasn't hostile. It was resolved. She attempted to frame the movement as a smear campaign led by a small group of disgruntled residents. That narrative might have worked weeks earlier. Not now. Financial documents were projected onto a screen. The vendor registration records were displayed. Enforcement patterns were outlined in charts compiled by 2 retired accountants who lived on Birch Lane. The evidence wasn't emotional. It was methodical. When the vote was counted, the result was decisive. She was removed as president. The silence that followed wasn't celebratory. It was heavy. The weight of a community realizing how much authority they had surrendered out of convenience. Her husband was not present. She left without addressing the room again. But removal from office doesn't erase prior actions. Within days, the new interim board initiated a formal audit. They also submitted documentation to the city's HOA oversight office regarding potential governance violations. And separately, quietly, I forwarded certain public records and correspondence to the appropriate federal ethics liaison, not as retaliation, not as revenge, but because misuse of influence tied to law enforcement deserves review beyond neighborhood politics. Ridgeway Commons was stabilizing, but the investigation, both internal and external, was just beginning, and what it uncovered would determine whether this ended as a simple leadership change or something far more consequential. The weeks after the recall felt strangely quiet. No violation notices appeared on doors. No sudden policy changes were announced. The patrol walks with clipboard and camera had stopped entirely. Ridgeway Commons, for the first time in years, felt less like a monitored compound and more like a neighborhood. But quiet does not mean inactive. Behind the scenes, the audit moved forward. The interim board hired an independent accounting firm to examine 3 years of financial records. Every contract, every assessment, every emergency expenditure was pulled and reviewed. Residents received weekly transparency updates, something that had never happened under the previous leadership. The findings were not explosive in a criminal sense, but they were damning in a governance sense. The pool security contract had never gone through competitive bidding. Conflict of interest disclosure forms were incomplete. Several fines collected under expedited enforcement authority had no documented board approval. Funds allocated for landscaping improvements had been redirected to administrative security enhancements without a community vote. Individually, each issue might have been correctable. Together, they painted a picture of concentrated control operating without adequate oversight. The city's HOA Oversight Office acknowledged receipt of the board's complaint. That alone sent a ripple through the community. Oversight meant documentation. Documentation meant permanence. Meanwhile, her husband's department initiated its own internal review after the incident report from that night was flagged. A marked unit dispatched to assist in a civil HOA key dispute had raised procedural questions. Body camera logs, call classifications, dispatch notes, all of it was reviewed. The conclusion, as it was later summarized to residents through public records requests, was that while no criminal misconduct had occurred, the response reflected poor judgment in boundary assessment between personal affiliation and professional deployment. In simpler terms, the cruiser should never have been there. For Ridgeway Commons, that acknowledgement mattered. The former HOA president attempted to frame the outcome as political retaliation. A final email circulated through the community listserv claiming she had been targeted for strong leadership. But the tone no longer carried weight. Authority, once questioned publicly, is difficult to restore through volume alone. Over the next month, repayment checks were issued for improperly levied fines, including mine. The pool key policy was formally clarified in writing, affirming that access devices could only be revoked through full board vote and documented due process. New board elections were scheduled, this time with term limits added to the bylaws. Transparency became policy instead of promise. As for me, I resumed my early morning lap swims without incident. The same gate, the same water, the same brass backup key resting in my gym bag. Neighbors nodded differently now, not with curiosity, but with respect. Not because of my credentials, which I never discussed again, but because I had insisted on process when it would have been easier to surrender. Power unchecked grows comfortable. Power questioned grows accountable. Ridgeway Commons learned that lesson the hard way. The former president eventually sold her townhouse. The listing described the community as vibrant and engaged. In a way, that was finally true. What began as an attempt to confiscate a pool key had exposed something far larger. How easily small positions of authority can be inflated when no one pushes back. And how quickly they deflate when someone calmly does. I never intended to become the center of a neighborhood upheaval. I simply refused to accept that intimidation was governance. And in the end, that refusal restored balance to a community that had forgotten it had a voice. The pool water was still blue. The palm trees still defied the climate. Kids still ran across hot concrete in summer. But beneath the surface, Ridgeway Commons had changed. Because sometimes the smallest key unlocks the biggest reckoning.